In the quiet woods of New Jersey near the small town of Crystal Lake lies the remains of what was once a thriving summer camp, Camp Crystal Lake. To most, it's a place long abandoned, its cabins rotting, its shoreline silent. Those who remember, it's something else entirely. The site of one of the most disturbing murder sprees in American history. Between the 1950s and the late 1980s, a series of unexplained drownings, disappearances and brutal killings transformed this simple camp into a symbol of fear. Locals called it Camp Blood. Parents warned their children never to go near the lake. What began as a tragic accident in 1957 would, over 20 years later, erupt into a night of terror that claimed the lives of nearly every counsellor working there. This is the true story of Camp Crystal Lake and the murders of Friday the 13th. Welcome to Echoes of the Unknown, where we dive deep into the unsolved, the unexplained and the downright unbelievable. My name is James, and today we're looking at the curse of Crystal Lake and the Camp Blood Massacre, a shocking event that saw many young people stalked and murdered by a killer in the shadows of a picturesque lakeside community. If you like this kind of content and want to see more, don't forget to subscribe, like and share so we can give you more stories that will fascinate and terrify you. But for now, as we enter spooky season, this is the story of Camp Blood. The American summer camp tradition began in the late 19th century, born from an idealistic desire to reconnect children with nature. As industrialization took hold, many parents feared that city life was corrupting their children's sense of innocence and adventure. Camps offered an escape, a place where kids could swim, hike and learn self-reliance, under the watchful eyes of responsible adults. By the 1950s, summer camps had become a cornerstone of American culture. Every June, thousands of children were packed into buses and sent into the wilderness, often for weeks at a time. Counselors, usually college students or recent graduates, were hired to supervise, teach outdoor skills and ensure safety. But in remote areas far from police and emergency services, these camps also carried inherent risks. Accidents, drownings and disappearances weren't unheard of, but were often written off as tragic mishaps. Camp Crystal Lake, founded in the early 1930s, was one such idyllic place, a postcard image of American innocence. Families across New Jersey trusted it as a safe haven for their children, but beneath the laughter and the campfire songs, dark rumours were whispered among the locals. Tales of strange accidents, unexplained deaths, and a curse that clung to the lake like fog. By the time the first bodies were found in 1958, the myth of the safe summer camp had already begun to unravel. Camp Crystal Lake was established in 1935, just a few miles from the small New Jersey town of the same name. It's located in Wessex County. The town is about 20 miles from the nearest populated settlement of Carpenter. Surrounded by dense forest and fed by a natural spring, the camp was intended as a wholesome escape for children from nearby cities. Owned and operated by David and Louise Christie, the camp quickly became a local institution, known for its pristine lake, friendly staff, and strong sense of community. For over 2 decades, Camp Crystal Lake thrived. Hundreds of children passed through its gates every summer, returning home with stories of canoe races, bonfires, and lifelong friendships. But in 1957, that reputation was shattered by tragedy. That summer, a young boy named Jason Voorhees, the son of the camp cook Pamela Voorhees, drowned in the lake. Accounts suggest he was unsupervised when he slipped beneath the surface. Counsellors assigned to watch him were allegedly preoccupied, sneaking away from their duties. Jason's body was never recovered. The drowning was ruled an accident, but for Pamela Voorhees, it was an unforgivable negligence. Locals recall her becoming reclusive and unstable in the months that followed. Some claim to hear her talking to herself in town or shouting at unseen figures. 1 year later, in 1958, the camp was preparing to reopen under the same management. During that summer, 2 counsellors, identified as Barry Jackson and Claudette Hayes, were brutally murdered inside one of the camp's cabins. Both victims were found with fatal knife and machete wounds. Their killer was never caught. The murders forced Camp Crystal Lake to close indefinitely. Over the following decades, multiple attempts were made to reopen the camp, but each ended in disaster. A series of unexplained fires prevented the summer season of 1959 from getting underway, and in 1962, the water supply was mysteriously poisoned. By the late 1960s, Camp Blood, as the locals had come to call it, had earned a reputation for death and misfortune. The surrounding community distanced itself from the lake entirely. Businesses stopped using its name, and property values around the area plummeted. The Christie family eventually abandoned the project, their dreams of a peaceful summer retreat buried under 2 decades of tragedy. Still, the stories persisted, of strange lights in the woods, whispers at night, and an eerie sense that the lake itself was alive, waiting for more blood to be spilled. By the summer of 1979, Camp Crystal Lake had sat abandoned for nearly 2 decades. Nature had reclaimed most of the grounds. The once cheerful cabins now sagged under rotting wood and creeping vines. The Christie family, who had owned the property since its founding, had long struggled to shed its cursed reputation. That year, Steve Christie, son of the original owners David and Louise, decided to attempt what no one had dared since the 60s, to reopen Camp Crystal Lake to the public. Local authorities warned him against it, as did several residents who still remembered the 1958 murders. But Christie was determined. He spent over $25,000 of his own money refurbishing the camp, repairing its plumbing, painting cabins, and replacing old docks. To him, this was a chance to restore his family's name and bring prosperity back to Crystal Lake. Steve hired a small team of 7 counsellors and staff to assist in the camp's renovation. Among them was Alice Hardy, a 19-year-old from California studying art and psychology. Alice had been in a relationship back home, but had come east seeking a clean slate. Her relationship with Steve was complicated, described by others as quietly romantic, professional on the surface. Alongside Alice were Jack Burrell and Marcy Standler, a young couple known for their outgoing personalities, as well as their close friend Ned Rubinstein, the group's resident prankster. Ned was light-hearted and playful, often providing comic relief during long workdays. Bill Brown, an easygoing guitar-playing counsellor, became Alice's closest confidant during their time at the camp. Brenda Jones, intelligent and kind, was regarded as the heart of the group, always the one to break tension and keep spirits high. Rounding out the staff was Annie Phillips, the camp's cook. Bright and idealistic, Annie dreamed of working with children and spending her summers outdoors. She was known for her infectious optimism, a stark contrast to the gloom that still hung over Crystal Lake. Tragically, she would never arrive at the camp alive. Steve Christie's efforts to bring life back to Camp Crystal Lake began in earnest in early June. The counsellors cleaned cabins, repainted the main lodge and prepared the lake for swimming. During the day, the atmosphere was hopeful, even joyful. As night fell, a different tone settled over the camp, that of unease. The woods seemed unnaturally quiet. Strange noises echoed from the tree line. Locals avoided the area, still haunted by the old rumours. Some, like a man named Ralph Neely, known around the town as Crazy Ralph, took it upon themselves to warn the newcomers that the camp was cursed. His warnings were dismissed as superstition, the ramblings of an eccentric old drunk. Still, those who spoke with the surviving witnesses later recall a shared sentiment amongst the counsellors that week, that something felt wrong, that they were being watched. Friday, June 13th, 1979, the date would later be described by investigators as a massacre at Camp Crystal Lake. The weather that morning was clear and humid, with temperatures reaching the high 70s. The group of counsellors had arrived on site that day, preparing the camp for its reopening the following week. Spirits were high. The day began like any other, repairs, chores, and last-minute touch-ups before the expected arrival of any campers. But before noon, tragedy had already struck. Annie Phillips was just 19 years old, bright-eyed, optimistic, and full of dreams. Raised in a small New Jersey town, she spent her teenage years volunteering at youth centres and summer programs. Her friends later described her as the kind of girl who saw the best in everyone. When she was hired by Steve Christie to work at the camp cook for the newly reopened Camp Crystal Lake, Annie saw it as the perfect opportunity, a fresh start, a summer outdoors, and a chance to work with children, something she loved deeply. She left home early on that morning of Friday, June 13th, 1979, backpack over her shoulder, unaware that she was walking towards tragedy. After a brief stop at a local diner for directions, She accepted a ride from a truck driver named Enos, who warned her about the camp's dark history. He told her about the drowning of a boy in 1957, the unresolved double homicide that followed, and the arson that had closed the camp years later. Annie laughed it off. To her, they were just ghost stories. But Enos's warnings were more than local superstition. They were prophecy. After Enos dropped her off near the crossroads, a passing motorist, believed to be a woman driving a green Jeep, offered her a ride the rest of the way. Witnesses along County Route 21 recalled seeing Annie in that same vehicle at approximately 11:45 a.m. She was never seen alive again. Her body would later be discovered deep in the forest by responding officers, her throat slashed with a hunting knife. Unaware of Annie's fate, the remaining 6 counsellors continued their work. Steve Christie had gone into town for supplies that afternoon, leaving Alice, Bill, Brenda, Jack, Marcy and Ned behind. The group spent the early evening near the lake, swimming and joking around. Ned staged a fake drowning, prompting laughter and mild irritation from the others. As the sun set, a thunderstorm rolled in from the northwest. The counsellors retreated to their cabins. Steve, delayed by the storm, ate dinner at a local diner before heading back towards the camp around 9 p.m. At approximately 8:30 p.m, Ned was last seen following a figure into one of the empty cabins. Witnesses later recalled him joking about seeing someone moving in the shadows near the lodge. He was never seen again. Meanwhile, Jack and Marcy retired to one of the bunks. Heavy rain began to fall as thunder rolled across the lake. Unbeknownst to them, Ned's body lay lifeless above them, hidden on the top bunk. While Marcy left to visit the washroom, Jack was attacked from beneath the bed. His throat was punctured by an arrow, killing him instantly. Marcy was attacked in the restroom. Investigators believe she was murdered there shortly afterwards, struck in the face with one fatal blow with an axe. At the main lodge, Alice, Bill and Brenda passed the time by playing Monopoly. They drank beer, smoked marijuana and joked to drown out the sound of the storm. Around 10 p.m, Brenda went outside. It's thought she may have heard a noise or thought somebody was in trouble. After all, that is who Brenda was. Somebody always first on the scene when help was needed. She ventured out alone. Moments later, the lights at the range flickered on and off. Witnesses later reported hearing a single scream, and Brenda was never seen alive again. At around 11 p.m, Steve Christie was en route back to camp when he ran his Jeep off the road in part due to the increasingly poor weather conditions. Wessex County Police Sergeant Jack Tierney picked him up and offered to drop him off at the camp. However, just as they approached, Tierney's radio signalled an emergency, and Steve had no option but to take the remaining few hundred yards by foot. Sergeant Tierney watched him walk up the trail to the camp entrance, not knowing at the time that he would be the last person to see Christie alive. His body was found later. He'd been viciously stabbed in the abdomen, his liver dissected by a brutal attack. Alice and Bill, growing increasingly uneasy about the unexplained disappearances, decided to investigate. They discovered an axe placed in Brenda's bed, the camp phone lines cut, and the generator malfunctioning. Rain continued to pour as the night grew colder. When the lights went out completely, Bill volunteered to check the generator shed. Alice waited in the lodge, but when he failed to return after a few minutes, she went to look for him. There, pinned to the door with arrows through his chest and neck, was Bill's body. Alice ran back to the main lodge, barricading herself inside. She armed herself with a fireplace poker and frantically locked the doors. At around 12:30 a.m, Brenda's body was hurled through the cabin window with tremendous force. Moments later, headlights appeared outside. Believing it was Steve returning, Alice ran towards the vehicle for help. Instead, she was met by an unfamiliar middle-aged woman who introduced herself as Mrs. Voorhees, an old friend of the Christies. Mrs. Voorhees appeared calm at first, comforting Alice as they re-entered the lodge, but when she saw Brenda's mutilated body, her demeanour shifted. She began to speak about her son, a boy named Jason, who had drowned at the camp in 1957. Her tone grew increasingly erratic as she blamed the counsellors for his death, shouting that they were making love while he drowned. Then came the horrifying revelation that Pamela Voorhees was the killer. Alice fled as Mrs. Voorhees attacked her with a hunting knife. The chase moved from cabin to cabin, through storm and across the muddy terrain. Several times Alice managed to knock her down, only for the woman to rise again, seemingly fueled by rage and grief. The pursuit ended near the edge of Crystal Lake. There, under the flickering light, Alice fought back using a canoe paddle. In a final desperate act of self-defense, she grabbed the machete that Mrs. Voorhees had dropped, and she decapitated her. The violence ceased. The storm subsided, and by dawn, Camp Crystal Lake was silent once more. When police arrived later that morning, they found the camp in ruins. Every counsellor except Alice Hardy was dead. She was discovered unconscious in a canoe floating near the centre of the lake, her hands clutching the oar, her face pale with exhaustion. According to Alice's statement, she awoke just after sunrise. The water was still, and the air hung heavy with mist. Then, she claimed, the body of a young boy, decayed, pale and waterlogged, surfaced beside the canoe and dragged her beneath the water. Police divers found no trace of a child in the lake. Alice later told investigators, "Then he's still there." The murders at Camp Crystal Lake would remain one of New Jersey's most infamous mass killings, an incident that locals still referred to as the Camp Blood Massacre. And though the official file was closed later that year, the whispers continued, and for Alice, her nightmare didn't end that morning, just a few months later, in the most brutal fashion. To understand the tragedy at Camp Crystal Lake, one must first understand Pamela Sue Voorhees, the woman at the centre of it all. Born in 1926 in Westbrook, New Jersey, Pamela's early life was marked by hardship. Records from local archives showed a troubled upbringing, including an unstable family home and allegations of domestic violence. She married a man named Elias Voorhees in her late teens, and in 1946 she gave birth to her only child, Jason, a boy who was born with severe physical deformities and cognitive disabilities. Neighbours later described her as a deeply devoted if overprotective mother, a woman who would do anything for her son. In the late 1950s, Pamela took a position as cook at Camp Crystal Lake, where Jason often accompanied her. Witnesses recalled seeing the boy playing alone near the water, frequently bullied by other children. Then, in the summer of 1957, tragedy struck. Jason, left unsupervised by camp staff, drowned in the lake. His body was never recovered. According to local police reports, Pamela's grief quickly turned into anger. She blamed the counsellors for neglect, alleging that they were distracted and sinful, more interested in each other than in their responsibilities. 1 year later, in 1958, two teenage counsellors, Barry Jackson and Claudette Hayes, were murdered inside a storage cabin. Their throats were slashed with a hunting knife. The case was never solved, but surviving staff members at the time spoke of a woman's voice and feminine laughter heard near the scene. Camp Crystal Lake was subsequently shut down. Pamela vanished from public life soon after. Throughout the 1960s and early 1970s, attempts to reopen the camp repeatedly ended in disaster, fires, poisoned wells and vandalism. Though no one was ever charged, locals reported sightings of a middle-aged woman in the woods near the lake, watching from a distance. When the camp was finally reopened by Steve Christie in 1959, Pamela Voorhees returned. Her reappearance was initially unnoticed, blended in as a local resident with ties to the Christie family. But as later investigation revealed, the grief and guilt she carried had evolved into a delusional obsession. Psychologists who reviewed her case posthumously described her as suffering from dissociative psychosis and delusional fixation, symptoms often associated with prolonged trauma and unresolved loss. In her mind, Jason was still alive, trapped in the lake, and anyone who had entered Camp Crystal Lake was a threat to him. Pamela Voorhees' rampage on that June night was not the act of pure madness alone, but of a mother consumed by grief. Her pain turned into violence in the most horrific way. And while she died that night by Alice Hardy's hand, her story and the legend of her son was far from over. When dawn broke over Camp Crystal Lake on June 14, 1979, authorities discovered a scene that would haunt New Jersey investigators for decades. 7 people, Steve Christie, 5 counsellors and 1 cook, were dead. The only survivor, Alice Hardy, was found drifting unconscious in a canoe on the lake's surface. Her testimony painted a chilling picture, a grieving mother driven to madness, avenging the loss of her drowned son. The official report listed Pamela Sue Voorhees as the primary suspect, deceased at the scene, decapitated during a struggle with Hardy. The case was formally closed that summer. The Voorhees name faded into local legend, whispered around campfires and in roadside diners as the curse of Camp Crystal Lake. One question remained. When investigators dredged the lake in the days following the murders, they found no trace of Jason Voorhees. No bones, no remains, nothing to confirm that he ever left those dark waters. Alice Hardy's final words to police would keep the mystery alive for generations. He's still there. The case of Camp Crystal Lake would remain dormant until, just a few months later, the nightmare returned. Thank you for tuning in to this episode of Echoes of the Unknown. What do you think of the Camp Blood Massacre? Do you believe Alice that she was dragged under the water by a decrepit man-child? Or had the trauma simply got into her mind? Pop your thoughts in the comments below. This story's far from over, so to be sure to do all the sharing and subscribing and like button fiddling so you don't miss part 2 of this incredible true story. Lots more good stuff coming up, but until next time, enjoy spooky season and remember, keep listening for the echoes.